What a great turnout. Happy Love Friday. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Friday Research Seminar. Super happy to see everyone in the room and those who are joining in the clouds through Zoom. For those of you who are on Zoom, please note that we have you in a webinar setting, so your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question, please use the question and answer feature, and we'll be monitoring the question and answers and reading questions out loud and so that the presenter can hear them. And right now, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Andy Hertel, research scientist from the Samaritan Health Services in our hometown, Corvallis, Oregon. He earned his Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of Minnesota. And throughout his career, Dr. Hertel has investigated social and cognitive factors of health behavior patterns with particular focus on identity and substance use. In his position at the Samaritan Health Services Research Development Office, Dr. Hertel supports research efforts and develops his program on health behavior, focusing on substance use, which we will hopefully learn more about today. Welcome, Dr. Hertel.
Well, obviously, really happy to be here. One thing I'll note is, say a little bit about this, that I can only be teaching position where I'm in class quite consistently, but I'm a little bit out of the habit of it. So I know I tend to speak fairly quietly, so if you need me to speak up, please speak up. And then second, the other thing I'd say is this is a really fresh talk from the ground up. So I anticipate some questions and I'm really excited to get with questions. So my talk will involve in two parts. I'm going to first talk about research at Samaritan Health Services. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about research that I've done on what I call a novel intervention technique. I'll present two studies. One is on this technique for preventing drinking identity. So I've developed a drinking identity misfit perception technique. I call it MT. Oh, it's really nice for English writing sometimes. And then the other is a test of what I call the cannabis using identity misfit perception technique, what we're going to call the CT. And then I'll talk a little bit about future directions, which includes a brief sort of description of putting together the architecture mechanism, specifically that should go away. And then good questions. So first, just a little bit more about me. There we go. I'm a research scientist in the Research Development Office at Samaritan Health Services. My specific roles are to support great writing and manuscript writing within Samaritan, also to facilitate collaboration with external partners like investigators and the state, and then to broadly facilitate the development of the research program at Samaritan. I've been here just since January. Prior to coming here, I was a tenured associate professor at Olaf College, which is a small arts college in Western. Currently has approximately 1,000 students. I'm a social health psychologist. My primary training was in social psychology with the focus of the trainings in health, specifically health behavior. And so by and large, my program research has been on psychology and health behavior with a focus on substance use, from smoking cessation to adolescent smoking to alcohol use to cannabis. Samaritan Health Services serves about 200,000 people in the Tri-County area. There are 5 hospitals in the system. There are about 80 different clinics that cover nearly all of the specialties. One of the parts of Samaritan insurance business called Samaritan Families. In this, in particular, a large percentage of Samaritan health plans on the terrible education. They're actually insure Medicaid, people of agency CCL is to make sure that those real help. There's also a graduate medical education program. We currently have 11 different programs. This program serves about 100 residents and fellows a year. One of the components for all of these residents, or not all of them, but many of them, at some point during residency, is to develop a research activity project, which is something that the Research Development Office aims to support. The Research Development Office is Maria Kaiser, sitting up here in the front, who will also gladly field questions, particularly about our research at Samaritan. Lena's a epidemiologist. She's the director of outcomes and research, which includes overseeing the Research Development Office as well as the Clinical Research Office. We have some people in the Clinical Research Office here, Tony and Kristen and Steph. And then also health education. It also includes Zoe Herrera, who's an epidemiologist and statistician. Julia did a postdoc here, so you're familiar with that. And so, generally, the Research Development Office supports all things research at Samaritan. That's a really big bucket. So leave it at that. It's all things research. But a lot of that is projects initiated in Samaritan by providers and by residents. It also includes collaboration with real partners in the most expensive. One of the things that I think is interesting about this research development office, and I think that sees this as an interesting component too. We are, we're a research office. It's unique in that it's in a relatively small community-based healthcare system. 200,000 people served is big to me, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively small system. And then also we're integrated into the healthcare system. And this is in contrast to research office like at Kaiser Permanente or at Health Partners, but by and large, those research outfits consist of investigators who are getting external funding, but then also happen to be attached to the healthcare system. Going back to the second bullet point, we are very interested in establishing collaboration with external partners. One of the goals of my talk here is to get to know you a little bit more. And so to that end, it's just important to note that we've got a lot of resources that we can provide for research. It could be to research. So one, data. We got a phone or real world data. You are collaborative. We have specifically use the Epic system. We have a lot of data. It's not always the easiest data to work with. It takes a little bit of wrangling, but there's a lot of really interesting data there. It's something we're continuing to build up in terms of also easing just how to work with that data. So one of our primary areas I need to look in a little bit more is putting a primer together for what it means to actually access the data. We also have claims data through Samaritan Health Plans. We also can facilitate recruitment of patients. We like to point out there are particular patients that you may not otherwise ever have access to that we could help facilitate access to. And then also staff. For instance, Jesse Deach over in psychology is currently leading document study with United Shift Nurses. It's a study about sleep. So we're helping facilitate. We can also provide clinical expertise and oversight. Physicians can provide this clinical services, blood work, lab work. And then we also have an institutional review board. And one thing that's a note about that institutional review board is that there's a cooperative agreement between Samaritan and the state. So someone as an Oregon State investigator, to the extent that fits, can go to the IRB. Just some examples of collaborations. Showing you some about Robinson. We've got maybe get them to dialogue. As fluently as I can talk about this. Details to cover with. But ways in which the Research Development Office facilitates interaction with development Samaritan projects in this period. The clinical research office really coordinates all operations participants. There's data captured and electronic record. Procedures are being conducted at Samaritan Athletic Medicine buildings read by research. We help with billing. Pharmacy helps put together the medications and buying the medications, buying and studying. There's lab work that needs to be done. And then also physicians from various departments in institutional medicine, it's like medicine, have provided insight as far as I understand study protocol, design, and ensuring patient safety and eligibility. So that's one example of collaboration. Here's another example is collaboration on what we call a homeless data optimization project, which involves one development environment. What this is a project where data from Community Services Consortium, which runs all housing and urban development programs we try to and data from Samaritan are put together while maintaining privacy in each of the data sets. So you can imagine want to maintain privacy in the Community Services Consortium data, maintain privacy in the Samaritan data. The trick is if you try to maintain privacy where you don't identify individuals, how do you merge them And what this harmonization does is merge them in a way via an algorithm where you can connect the data as well. It's super advantageous for investigating things like healthcare use in conjunction with homelessness status and legalizing homelessness services, because, for instance, CFC has data about homeless services and those experiencing homelessness. Samaritan doesn't have all of that data. Samaritan does have a lot of data about healthcare use, but doesn't have a lot of data about homelessness services. So merging those two data sets allows them to look at, for instance, healthcare use across experiencing homelessness. So Research Development Office sort of facilitates interaction for this project through the IH and CCO. It's called the Community Health Research Institute. This project is also funded through the Sharon Initiative, which is a marine side of the organization. Also, data within our EMR is used and facilitate access to that, and then really the harmonization of data. So those are just a couple of examples. Lots of other examples. Urban has done some work with us, and just Coleman has done some work with us. Plenty of opportunities. So this one, I'm going to transition into talking about my research, but happy to feel we, Chris and Sam and Tony, we're happy to share any questions that investigators have.
Question.
Yes.
Do your collaborations extend beyond the Tri-County area, or is it mostly
Here? And I think our focus really is to figure out the work it's like potential collaborations outside of that. We want to keep things in the community to a certain degree to facilitate. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about specifically what I call preliminary studies for the development of a novel intervention technique for the prevention of substance use. And my focus here is on alcohol misuse and cannabis misuse. We have prevention of substance use identity among college students. So a lot to unpack here. There are 5 important terms, I think, here that I really want to talk about with respect to what they mean in my work. The first is intervention technique. And by that, specifically for my work, which is ultimately aimed at preventing misuse, which is a behavior, focused on behavior change techniques, which can be defined as an observable, replicable, and human useful component of an intervention designed to change behavior. So one way to think about what I'm talking about here is to think about it potentially being packaged in a larger intervention to prevent misuse. Second term, prevention. By prevention, I mean either reducing or inhibiting the development. So reducing the degree to which someone may identify as someone who drinks versus, or also at the same time preventing that identification from occurring. By misuse, I work with the NIHLA definition of misuse for alcohol, which is excessive alcohol consumption, including drinking, heavy drinking, to quite increased risk for negative consequences. And these consequences running the range from as severe to very severe for college students. That's, for instance, missed class, all the way to sexual assault, all the way to death. There's less of an agreed upon definition of cannabis misuse. Generally, you can think about cannabis misuse as too much use. This could be daily use or use to negative consequences for physical and social health or moving out. And then not finals, one other important, but I'm going to skip to college students. I define college students as full-time 18 to 25-year-old students. Some will define this as 18 to 22-year-old students. I use 18 to 25-year-olds, 18 to 22-year-olds. I use 18 to 25-year-olds just because it's really different. And then last but not least, substance use identity. So first, this is what I mean by identity. By identity, I mean your definition of yourself or your response to the STEM I am. And this delineates not only how you are unique as an individual, but also how you represent others. I conceptualize this as consisting of what I call identity attributes, which are characteristics, including values, beliefs, beliefs. So when I say, for instance, I'm a researcher who likes health behavior research and want to improve healthcare via what I learned from health behavior research, I'm expressing something about my identity. By substance use identity, I mean this. It's when your use of a substance is part of your self-definition, where it is one of your identity attributes. That's it. So imagine you may be conjuring different ideas that were meant by substance use identity. But I mean it fairly simplistically. It's just, do you think that drinking is part of you? Right? If, for instance, you say drinking is part of my self-image, or drinking is a large part of my daily life, or personality, others view drinking as part of my personality, then we're not like drinking. I've selected these 5 statements. These 5 statements are particular because these 5 statements are used in what's typical mention of drinking identity. I'll return to that through the first thing. So one thing you say is, big picture, my aspirations are however bad is used, so it's substances, cannabis use. But at the same time, a pretty narrow focus on this one tiny element of psychology, which is identity. Okay, so you may be asking me, why college students? Why focus on college students? There's a whole range of individuals and a whole range of individuals in which misuse may occur. But why focus on college students? And really, it's because in part there's escalation of use from before college to the college years. So here are 2 figures from one of the most recent national surveys of drug abuse and health, 2022. Figure on the left is a figure of percentage of bigger list of each use marijuana on a daily basis. One thing to note in the language marijuana is used, I try to use that specific term because it's associated with some bias in the terms. Why not about listens and identities and it's not marijuana. What you can see here is from some of these numbers get blurred, sorry, but at least by the graphs you can see from the 12 to 17-year-old teenage years to the 18 to 25-year-old years, those years that include being a college student, there's an uptick in being marijuana use, and there's also an uptick in daily use. In terms of heavy drinking, which you can see on the right, from the teenage years to the college years, there's an uptick in binge drinking. Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Yeah. This is the prompt I needed. So I'll kick into the booming voice that I used to know a little bit more. But yeah, tell me if you can talk about others. So these 2 figures are sort of representation of the fact that college itself tends to be a risk factor. So the figures before it was 18 to 25-year-olds versus teenagers, but that could be all 18 to 25-year-olds, not just college students. Here we see that college students is particularly a risk factor, at least for alcohol. So these figures show that from the black bar to the yellow bar, all these are 18 to 22-year-olds. The black bar represents 18 to 22-year-olds who are not college students. The yellow bar represents those who are college students. But we see higher rates of binge drinking and heavy drinking amongst college students compared to same age non-college students. We don't necessarily see that particular pattern for cannabis use. Actually, what we see is that non-college students are more likely to use cannabis than college students. But it is notable that you get that uptick from the teenage years to the 18 to 25-year-old years. And the trend has been increasing cannabis use over time amongst college students. They also ask, do we really need to further our efforts to prevent misuse among college students? After all, there's been a lot of effort put towards misuse in college students. So consider alcohol use. Some of you have probably heard of programs like alcohol.edu, which are designed towards preventing alcohol misuse. NIAAA has put together a guidebook that they call the College AIM. AIM stands for Alcohol Prevention Matrix. On the right, they have a huge list of individual strategies for preventing alcohol misuse. The strategy that or the techniques that I'm going to talk about, I consider individual level strategies too, and that they're focused on by individual trying to shift identity, trying to shift behavior. Well, you can see there's been a lot of effort towards preventing misuse. The unfortunate thing is, even though all of these different strategies are efficacious, their impact tends to be modest and it tends to be fairly short-lived. So there's been calls to increase the effectiveness of interventions. There's sort of less of a robust body of work on cannabis misuse prevention, but nonetheless, for what's there, there's been calls also to increase the impact in civil interventions. And then finally, you might ask, why focus on substance use identity of all the different like psychological factors that you can focus on, and in broader of all the different social factors you can focus on? Why identity? And because it tends to matter, at least it looks like it matters. There's a really solid amount of evidence out there which at least indicates that it's a risk factor for substance misuse. So it predicts substance misuse, strong positive correlations. It predicts it over time. Increases in it predict increases in substance misuse over time. And it predicts substance misuse, controlling for other important psychological factors, including what I like to label cognitive affective mechanisms of misuse, including things like expectations about outcomes of use or perceived norms for use or different types of motives for use. Not only that, but evidence suggests that it also relates to these cognitive affective mechanisms of misuse, which then relate to misuse, where the overall picture is there might be a direct effect of substance use identity on substance misuse, but also an indirect effect of these other cognitive mechanisms, which sets up this notion that it could really be kind of a potent intervention target in terms of having impacts ultimately on substance misuse. Okay, so then the next question is, if this is the case, and if you want to prevent substance use identity or in order to prevent substance misuse, how do you go about doing that? And in theory and evidence, primarily out of social psychology, boils down to indicating this, that a perception of misfit between your identity attributes and identity attributes you associate with using the substance should translate to less of a substance use identity. So imagine, for instance, you're somebody who thinks about yourself as risk averse. But let's imagine that you think about someone who drinks as a risk taker. There's a mismatch, right? You think about yourself as risk averse, you think about someone who drinks as a risk taker. Through that mismatch, there'll be less inclination for you to say, yes, drinking is something that defines me. Drinking is part of my self-image. So, to that end, encouraging a college student to perceive a misfit between their identity attributes and the identity attributes that they associate with substance use, what I call an identity misfit perception, might lead them to have less and less substance use. And to that end, come the techniques that I've been developing and testing. One, the drinking identity misfit perception technique, in misusing or the symptom. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about drinking identity misfit perception technique tests. It's one of drinking identity, one of several preliminary studies that have been involved in this technique. And then I'll talk about the SIMT test. The SIMT test is an adaptation of the SIMT test, and once I get to that, I'll be able to reset out pretty quickly. But I'll focus on the results because I think the results are really interesting compared to what we've seen in DMT. But the DMT looked like this. It was a study that lasted 5 weeks. Participants filled out a variety of relevant baseline measures on day 1. Then they were randomly assigned to conditions. So this was 2 between subjects, experimental design, classified as a clinical trial. After being randomly assigned to condition, they were either randomly assigned to DMT experimental condition. This is the condition in which I tried to encourage drinking identity misperceptions, or a control condition. For the next 3 days, they engaged in tasks relevant to those different conditions. On day 4, I assessed everything that I assessed at baseline, and then also assessed those things 5 weeks later. In terms of real important assessments that occurred, 1, I assessed drinking identity at baseline, as well as at day 4 and 5 weeks later. And then I assessed misfit perceptions on days 1 through 3. Participants came through Prolific. How many of you are here familiar with Prolific? Yeah, I was guessing. Maybe many of you would not be familiar with Prolific. I conducted this study online. Prolific is a participant pool website where people are recruited to become part of the participant pool through social media advertisements, but also advertisements through flyers on college campuses. All of the participants are 18 years or older. Participation on this platform by default is anonymous. Participants get to studies by looking through what's called their dashboard and finding studies that they find interesting and want to participate in, or studies are directly emailed to them if they're eligible for the studies. When participants first sign up, they complete a variety of measures, which then sets up the ability to pre-screen based on their answers to these measures for being considered inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it's a nice way to kind of rapidly curate a set of participants that you want in your study. It comes with the pitfalls of online research, right? I think there's always a little bit of suspicion that who the participants are or who the participants say they are isn't really who they are. That being said, there has been, a fairly decent amount of studies that have evaluated the validity of the sample, and most of those studies tend to show that the sample is valid. That who we think is participating in our studies is actually those people that are participating in our studies. So there's that. For me, this is actually really advantageous. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm always worried about things like demand effects, and so to that extent, the less I'm actually face-to-face interacting with participants, maybe the better. And so having participants online that are anonymous reduces those demand effects quite a bit. And then the other thing is for some sensitive topics like cannabis use, which is illegal for some, it's much better if I can study that in an anonymous than that. So lots of advantages there. Okay, so through pre-screening and then doing some validation of pre-screening through some data collected at the baseline assessments, ended up with 254 participants. We had 129 in the DMT experimental condition, 125 in the control condition. In terms of demographic differences, I was really focused on these criteria, so not a lot of differences here, but I did recruit from the US, UK, or Canada. Partly prolific is actually, I think it's maybe even based out of the UK, and maybe it's based out of Europe, but it's across the Atlantic Ocean. So there tends to be a heavier population of students there. So in this particular study, the majority of sample was from the UK, also the majority was white. The DMT experimental condition amounted to 3 different, what I call DMT tasks. And in all of these tasks, I had participants just write about identity attributes. So went into this study sort of thinking, well, one, I want to create a misfit perception, but I also want to explore the best way to create that misfit perception. So I tried to develop more than one task. So here are 3 tasks. And then I also wanted to impact drinking identity as much as I could. So I thought, let's test this by having more tasks rather than just. So I developed 3 different tasks. In all tasks, participants wrote about identity attributes. It's just that the different tasks asked them to write about different identity attributes. So task 1, participants were asked to write about identity attributes that they associate with maybe someone drinks too much, that does not fit with how they describe themselves. I thought about this as a direct route to a misfit perception where I was really trying to encourage participants to focus on describing identity attributes, describing thinking. Task 2, I had participants write identity attributes that they associate with being someone who does not drink too much, that they also think fits with how they describe themselves. Maybe they have the same identity attributes, for instance. Here, I consider this an indirect route to misfit perception, and that it was getting people to focus on similarity with identity attributes for an identity that was in contrast to a drinking identity. And then task 3, I asked the participants to write identity attributes that they thought were negative characteristics that could be associated with them if they were known as someone who drinks too much. And this I also considered an indirect route to misfit perceptions. It's really focused on trying to encourage participants to think about how a drinking identity is in contrast to their positive identity structures. We all like to think positively about ourselves, and we do a lot to think positively about ourselves. I always love these Cialdini studies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these studies, but Cialdini did these studies where he just observationally observed how many people on college, or how many students on the college campus would wear, the logo, the fit of the university after a successful sporting competitions from the university. So we're more people wearing Beaver sweatshirts after the Beavers football game. So yes, that is actually the case, and this is part of the reflection of positive identity strategies. The control condition engaged in the task was just actually one task, and it was describe yourself. So it's a standard self-description task, right? Write about identity attributes that you describe. So there are 4 important features of these tasks that I really want to point out. One, there's personalization. So I allow participants to self-generate their identity attachments. I didn't present identity attachments to them. I wasn't, for instance, running with a large body of work on what's called prototypes and asking people, hey, like, here's how people typically think about someone who drinks, or maybe even typically think about someone who drinks too much. Do these things describe you? I've steered away from that and instead allowed participants to generate their own identity attributes, thinking that there's not a lot, actually a ton of uniformity in how people think about these identity targets. And so allowing people to think about it on an individual level would be advantageous. I also left it up to participants to define what too much meant to them. So I had to think about drinking too much or not. Someone who doesn't drink too much, I left that up. For some people, for them, it could be drinking every day is too much. For some people, it could be drinking every week is too much. Or for some people, it could be having 5 or more drinks in any given occasion is too much. So I left some personalization there. There's also an egocentric focus. It was always comparing to self, right? So particularly task 1, it was how does someone who drinks too much compare to you? Or task 2, how does someone who doesn't drink too much compare to you? Task 3, it's a little bit of a weird thing to think about, that is egocentric comparison, but that was all about self, right? How do negative characteristics describe you? So there's an egocentric focus. There's also what I call like an active engagement or bias involvement of one's own identity. And to me, this is pretty critical. It was having people constantly think about what their identity is while processing others' identities, versus going back to a previous example, providing them with descriptors of, for instance, someone who drinks too much, and then putting that to the side, and then subsequently thinking about how one thinks about this. And then finally, I also leveraged the fact that use contributes to identification. So one, and this may not surprise you, the more you consume a substance, the more likely you are to identify that substance. So I getting people to think about how maybe they didn't drink as much as somebody else, or maybe drank to minimal levels. I was trying to encourage people to think about their substance use in a minimal way, which then may thereby provoke less of this thought that maybe this is something that. So one way to think about this misfit perception task is that they're sort of piggybacking off of also trying to minimize in one's head the extent to which they can consume the substance and okay, what did responses to these tasks look like? Well, people thought that someone who drinks too much doesn't fit with how they describe themselves, and that they thought that someone who drinks too much doesn't value health, escapes from problems, is low self-esteem, is very impulsive and responsible, lazy, really derogatory things. People thought that people who do not drink too much fit with how they describe themselves, and thinking that they're energetic, prepared, motivated, responsible, controlled, focused, really positive individuals. For task 3, people thought that these negative characteristics would describe them if they thought about if they were to be known as someone who drinks too much: sloppiness, out of control, laziness, chaotic, depressed, addicted. Participants in control conditions describe themselves this, in ways like this: introverted, they like football and soccer, they like technology, they're kind, outgoing. So thematically, one thing to note is really responses in the control condition were different from thematically from responses in the experimental conditions. The other thing to note is that task 1 responses and the task 3 responses were similar to each other in that they were both very negative. And then the task 2 response separated itself from the other response and the responses to the positive. So here are hypotheses. We expected that those in the DIMT experimental condition compared to those in the control condition would experience more of an impact on their misfit perception. So we see differences in misfit perceptions between these conditions. We also expected that those in the DIMT experimental condition would report less of a drinking identity in the control condition. So differences there. And then we also evaluated the extent to which drinking identity was correlated with some of those cognitive affective mechanisms that I introduced earlier. And for this study, I really considered these secondary outcomes. So the main goal was to see what happens here. We'll also see what happens here with that idea that this would sort of offer validation of whether we were actually impacting this. To the extent that we were impacting this, we should also see some sort of translation to these secondary outcomes. Now, experimentally tested, observationally tested, so using translation loosely, that was the idea behind this. I won't talk about too much about these secondary measurements of these secondary measures, other than just how many. We ask people, how many drinks do you drink? Do you think there are positive things that are going to happen as a function of the alcohol consumption? Do you have lots of motives for that, coping with negative emotions? etc. But I will focus on measurement of drinking identity and misfit perceptions. Should look familiar. I use the explicit alcohol self-concept scale. It's the scale that's typically used to assess drinking identity. These at an explicit level. There's also ways we can assess this at an implicit level using implicit association tests. One more here focused on explicit measurement. We asked participants how much they agreed with each of these different statements. Responses to the statements were strongly positively correlated with each other, so I averaged across them so that on the whole, the participants agreed with these statements. For misfit perceptions, I assessed misfit perceptions in line with the misfit perception test. So I asked people, does being something you describe being someone who drinks too much, how you describe being someone who drinks too much fits with how you describe yourself. I kept it worded in that way. So I'm talking about misfit perception. This is sort of opposite to misfit perception, but in terms of that phrasing and response scale, and it's just much easier to keep it as sort of a fit perception, but where about really think about it is indicating. So there, and so on. One thing that's important is that participants completed these assessments after they completed the test. So complete task 1, complete misfit perception assessment for task 2. Task 2, misfit perception assessment for task 2. So the purpose of these was to explore, well, okay, I'm doing this thing where I'm asking participants to engage in what I think is hopefully encouraging misfit perceptions. Are they actually experiencing these misfit perceptions? And then second, to see whether these translated to drinking identity. Because to the extent that it's having the impact that I thought it was having on drinking identity, it should be through these misfit perceptions. Okay, so results and sort of similar results. What I'm focused on here is significant results, except for notable. And these numbers here are all regression coefficients. We have a series of regression analyses. Our main measures onto the experimental condition and secondary outcomes onto the measures. But the upshot here is one, the drinking identity misfit perception task or technique or those in the control condition seem to have an impact in the way that we wanted it to happen. So it affected task 1 misfit perceptions, task 2 misfit perceptions, and task 3 misfit perceptions in the expected ways. So that was a positive. We did not see, unfortunately, an impact on drinking identity. So here, drinking identity as assessed at day 4. Also had drinking identity as assessed at day 5. No. So that was a little bit of push. Retrospectively, we started to consider that maybe we were asking too much when asking whether we could actually impact drinking identity after 3 days of this manipulation. And so here I'm thinking maybe this measure is really capturing a chronic trait identity that's not malleable unless there's a ton of influence. And so we sort of considered, well, maybe these misfit perception assessments are proxy measures for trait identity at more temporary level, or maybe these are representing temporary shifts in identity that perhaps once established more would translate to shifts in identity. So with that idea, we evaluated whether these misfit perceptions were associated with secondary memories. And at least at day 4, we observed that the task 2 misfit perception was correlated with a number of drinks that were reported since last survey at day 4, as well as intentions to drink in the future. The more you thought you fit with somebody who doesn't drink too much, the less you reported drinking, and the less you reported intentions to drink. And that translated to 5 weeks later, too. Same terms. So what do we take away from that study? It seemed, the DIPT appears promising. One thing to note is participants had an easy time with this. I asked things like, were the instructions clear? Well, yes, instructions are really clear. How descriptive were the things that you wrote? And by and large, people thought that the things that they wrote were really descriptive. Asked, how difficult was this for you to do? And most by and large said, this is pretty easy. So they seem to have an easy time engaging with the task. And the responses that you saw here were indicative of the responses I got. People followed the task, they did it well, and they did it on a consistent level. So it seemed to work in that way. And it also seemed to work to the extent that we did actually observe some impact on the perceptions, and on drinking identity itself, but maybe on those temporary proximate markers or more proximate markers. So one thing that one thought we had is maybe, really to have an impact in repeating engagement tasks to maybe make those misfit perceptions more established and translate. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to a brief overview of the cannabis using perceptions. I'm going to really, again, I'll focus on the results because I think the results here are a little bit confusing. But with same sort of design, 2 group between subjects, experimental design. In this study, rather than having a 5-week follow-up, I had just a 2-week follow-up. 231 participants through prolific after, validating pre-screening, 3 other people across the 2 different conditions. For this study, I only recruited 4 participants from the US. In terms of demographic differences, again, this study was the participants were same 3 tasks, just applied to cannabis instead. Directly to perception and in the direction doing dark groups. These images, so when I showed these head images for the DEMT, I put them up there. I got to talk about them, but I put them up there so you could sort of see visually what's happening. After the DEMT and then doing the SIP-T test, I thought, well, maybe we should actually give participants these head images too, because maybe it would help clarify for participants what they should be doing. So in this study, we actually included these head images in the prompts. And I think that actually may have helped contribute to the impact of the SIP-T that I've seen. So that was a little bit of difference. Responses maybe had a little bit more of a cannabis flavor, but also were fairly similar to what we saw in the DEMT. So pretty negative responses for task 1 and task 3, pretty positive responses for task 2. Control responses again differentiate themselves from the experience responses. So pretty similar things going on. And you might wonder, maybe they're operating off of stereotypes here to a certain degree, and stereotypes across different substances. But there's also a little bit of a flavor of things. Same hypotheses, by and large, same measurements, except for cannabis use here. We measure cannabis use as average number of sessions per day in the past 2 weeks. We'll get baseline and then 2 weeks. Also in hours since the last survey. Hours high ends up being really more about actual use. We adapted the explicit alcohol self-concept scale to measure cannabis using identity. So similar types of statements. Responses were pretty positive, correlated across statements. On the whole, if people agreed with the statements, this reflected that they had maybe cannabis using identity. They thought about cannabis and using cannabis. Misfit perceptions, just adapted from the victim. So, and then again, measured these to evaluate was the technique or the task having the impact that we thought they were having. And was that translating to the victim? Results here focusing on, by and large, significant results. We get regression coefficients. There was, we did observe what we would hope to observe in terms of differences in misfit perceptions. So those in the SIP-T experimental condition thought that they fit less with someone who uses cannabis too much, thought that it fits more with someone who doesn't use cannabis too much, and thought that they would be described pretty negatively if they're known to use cannabis too much, all in comparison to the control condition. Misfit perception is assessed that days 1 through 3 was correlated with motives at day 4, but in particular, a coping motive. So the idea that someone uses cannabis because it helps them cope with problems. The misfit perception effects persisted to day 4, so the data that was after the active phase of the experimental manipulation. The task 1 misfit perceptions were correlated with these 2 particular outcomes, average number of sessions past 2 weeks. This is assessed at 2 weeks, as well as intention studies in the future at 2 weeks. And then those misfit perception effects persisted to 2 weeks, so we're getting some longitudinal effect on the misfit perceptions. And also at 2 weeks, this popped up, where we saw at 2 weeks differences between the SIP-T experimental condition and the control condition. In terms of cannabis using identity with those in the experimental condition, reported less of a cannabis using identity. So I think this is really, I failed to mention this before, but one thing to note is consistently observed that these misfit perceptions, as theoretically they should, were correlated with cannabis using identity. This was particularly true for these first 2 misfit perceptions. This third misfit perception acts fairly inconsistently. So particularly strong effects here. But to that note, we also just looked, okay, can we validate that idea even more? And we observed that at least the first misfit perception, we really looked at some question cannabis using. So this CT appears also promising. We saw differences in cannabis use and identity at 2 weeks, so it had the impact on identity that we have. And it also seemed like there was a persistent impact on misfit perceptions, was also desirable. Why maybe more persistent or consistent effects in this versus empty? Not really sure. I mean, they are, after all, two different behaviors with two different types of implications. But it could be that cannabis use is more relevant. Maybe alcohol use amongst college student population is something that a lot of people do, but don't think it's special enough to think about as part of their definition. But for cannabis use, maybe they do more so. And again, sort of come to this conclusion that repeated tasking so the effects of this particular technique perhaps be establishing misfit perceptions to a greater degree. And I think this pattern that we saw where the misfit perceptions persisted over time, and then where after 2 weeks we saw differences in cannabis using identity speaks to that a little bit. It's almost like if these misfit perceptions can get established, then maybe they'll translate into shifts in identity. So really quick, future directions. This work, the preliminary studies guided a grant application that I developed that was specifically with the R15 mechanism. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the R15 mechanism, but the R15 mechanism is a mechanism at NIH that's specifically, in my case, with the area portion of the R15 mechanism for institutions where the majority of the students are undergraduate students, and for institutions that haven't received that much funding. Knox College is the only undergraduate institution that had a preliminary history of NIH funding. So I went through the R15 mechanism. This mechanism is special. It's a really cool mechanism because a big component of it is a robust training experience for the students who are involved in the project. So part of the application was really delineating, okay, here's my history of mentoring undergraduate students in research, and also here's my plan for how they'll be involved in this particular project. And in this case, it was going to be work through the academic year, but then also full-time work during this. What I proposed was sort of an expanded version of the DIPT test that I presented earlier. I was going to do this study at Knox College with Knox College students. It was still going to be done online, but it was going to be with students who are active students at Knox College. I boosted up the experimental phase, so rather than be 1 week, I boosted it up to 3 weeks. And it was going to have more extensive assessments, 1 month post that 3-week experimental phase, so it actually had sort of 4 weeks in the overall time, and then 4 months and 7 months to evaluate whether we were getting longitudinal effects or even to evaluate something similar to what we saw in CENTI when we vaccine emerged over time. And then I had expanded out measures for all the secondary measures. And the 2 tests that I described before, all of the measures for secondary outcomes works. Well, a twist in this proposal was that I was going to focus on first and second year students. So this is really what can be called a pre-escalation study, where I was focused on those students who maybe had consumed alcohol, but hadn't yet developed a misuse pattern, where the goal was to prevent the development of identity in order to prevent the development of misuse. So I had proposed this for R15. I'm no longer at Knox, and so that R15 isn't something I'm eligible for anymore. So I'm currently sitting on, well, what do I do with this? Because I think it's worthy of pursuing. And they gave out funding opportunities outside of NIH, but also maybe different mechanisms within NIH and different set of collaborations. So that's it. Just thinking for people, one, who are involved in this work, Dr. Kristen Lindgren, who was actually co-investigator on the R15. She's at the University of Washington. Charles, as we're saying, Charles Robinson, Sam. Sam is now currently at the IRS. He's a statistician on this work. I think he's a friendly member for us. His job, as he described it now, is to talk to people about why they hate the IRS. So that's helpful. When we started working together, he was on a T32 postdoc training position at the University of Chicago. It's just absolutely statistical assessments. And then the group of students that was involved in the CIT in particular that were out of my lab at Knox College, Hawaii, back there, or so we in Zach Shack. And then had some small funding from the Society for Sound Social Psychology. So that's it. Mostly within time. But
Great. Questions from the room?
Yeah.
Would there be any reason to suspect that the results that you see would differ by whether the student was engaging in illegal behavior or not? Like in the UK, the 18, 19-year-olds can drink, so that's fine. In the US, obviously not. And then with the cannabis, it would depend on what state you're in and how old you are.
I would, I think that's a reasonable thing to consider. And I think in some ways, like I think I was younger and cannabis was illegal. If you use cannabis, that really
Oh, man, you were
yeah, you're fighting authority and that is something. Right? And I think identity is created. So yeah, I think there could be stronger identity for that, and maybe that would also mean that maybe a little bit more resistant to change. But it's something I haven't explored, and sort of with the cannabis data, they got rid of all geographical identifiers, and it didn't ask where the person resided. So I don't have the ability to stop that situation. I could, to a certain degree, with the alcohol data, because of UK versus the US, and maybe focusing on the students. That'd be cool to explore. I should do that. Yes. Yeah, thanks.
Questions online? Not yet. Yes. Others? Learn.
I'll take questions about the research and working with Samaritan resident experts in the Yeah, right.
So in fact, again, we're about getting involved in using your data.
They can reach out to Polina or me or so.
I'm handing the baton off.
Using the email address.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also less person specific and then
SHS research.
email.
SHS research at samhealth.org.
Oh, I was just gonna ask back to your proposed new intervention.
Yes.
Why increase in 3 weeks? Like, what was the rationale around why the larger intervention period? Like,
Well, two things. One, I felt like if we allow for more repeated engagement in the house, then more establishment. The other was I was actually going to rotate participants through the different tasks by week. So I'd have task 1, week 1, task 2, week 2, task 3, week 3, but in sort of a mandatory design. And that was going to allow me to, after each week, assess the impact of that specific task. And then do that not only between subjects across the weeks, but within subjects across the weeks. So it was to partly to improve the impact, but also partly to yeah.
So for your data, in your data regarding campus, or excuse me, colleges being a risk factor, were those all just 4-year campus-based institutions? Okay.
Yeah.
And so is there,
Don't call me on that because I'd have to look at the details of the table.
what literature is out there regarding like students who are commuting, and or e-campus and or hybrid college students?
Oh, I think this included that set. So those numbers include them. So it was just, are you full time? And including the community college students too. But I don't know if there was something else. Yeah, I'd imagine more of a residential experience.
Can you just clarify, did you receive the R15?
No.
Get feedback?
2 rounds. First round didn't get discussed. It's like, I don't know. But that was actually my first attempt at that. So I got really good feedback. Went through second round. It actually got discussed. I got a decent score. It was 41, but outside of and then just sort of let it sit. But I really felt positive after that round because I felt like the critiques were really.
You share some of the critiques are kind of what you would do.
Yeah, I mean, there was really a lot of the critiques ended up being about feasibility and working with my students. They really wanted a really clear plan. And something that was really unique, something that the students couldn't get elsewise, And then also something that extended across the campus. So I was providing students with an experience, but then we could also sort of let that experience that they were having disseminate across the campus in different ways. And some of that would have been students giving presentations about the state of alcohol. So that was a big part of it. And it was just kind of trying to really narrow it down and paint a really quick picture. The feasibility, they were concerned about my ability to get as many participants as I needed. We ended up we sort of ended up settling on, we were going to shoot for a number of participants that we thought was feasible, even if it wasn't necessarily a number that would fully follow us for all the different effects that we were looking at. That seemed reasonable, and I did some pretty good background work to make sure that we could get that number, but I think there's still some concerns. Those are two words. We thought about, so Knox is located in Galesburg, Illinois. 10 to 20 miles down the road, there's a town called Monmouth, which has Monmouth College, another small college. And at some point I was thinking, well, maybe I'll also recruit from there because they're pretty similar. Knox is better, of course.
Of course.
Okay, as the non-researcher in the room, but just a mom of kids going off to college. So is the idea that the more you do these tasks about their misfit perception, they will be less likely to identify as a drinker or a pot smoker?
Exactly. Yeah. So you could have them weekly.
but not if,
niece and nephew that
not if you're the mom.
have a vested interest. But yeah, you could. I mean, even I thought of, how are you different? You have your friends who are using. Like, how do you think you're different?
You just start thinking about your identity as.
Yeah.
And let me just extend that from not knowing as much about this research. Then what's the corollary with an actual sort of objective measurement of misuse? Because the identity issue so far,
Yeah.
I don't have a problem.
But
Yeah, the reality could be maybe different or very observable to everybody else. So I think
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think I take what we observe in terms of the correlations between identity and misuse at face value, where I do really think there's correspondence there, right? The less you identify, the more you drink. And this sort of sidesteps that issue of to sort of be denial, right? Like, no, this isn't part of my identity yet. I'm engaging in it. And I think in part, when thinking about that, then maybe thinking about really maybe a different level of misuse to begin with, where we're not going to see that as much of that denial effect, but maybe where it's actually really having some problems, but not trying to incorporate those problems that are. But I think that's an important issue to continue to think about and have frame what's happening here. We're also thinking there is potentially some sort of, but I think it's still an open question too. You know, I sort of carefully talked about, and Kristen encouraged me to think about this way too. When we look at correlations between substance use identity and substance misuse, while we're looking at its correlations, there has not been experimental work that's demonstrating potential effect, I think. And so we like to talk about it as a risk factor that could potentially be a thing that we could intervene on to have this particular effect. I sometimes think about these studies actually as the studies that trying to demonstrate whether there's an actual causal impact of identity and behavior with there might be causal impact. It's just leveraged through thinking about this as an image. Yeah.
You already mentioned you weren't sure what you're going to do about this proposal.
No, not sure yet. Gotta sort that out. Okay. Yeah.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.